Over the past decades, Chinese modernization is no longer a domestic narrative, but a focal case in global discussions on development. Many developing nations are at the crossroads of finding paths forward as they face challenges from stalled industrialization, infrastructure shortfalls, and energy transition pressures. It is imperative to answer: how can Chinese experience offer a realistic lesson for other countries in the Global South? In this episode of Global Vision, we're joined by Ben Norton, US journalist, analyst, and political economist, with a combined followers of over 1 million across platforms. He is known for data-driven analysis and his long-term focus on the shifts of global power and economy. In this conversation, he will analyze the impact of Chinese modernization in the Global South and how it can be understood, modeled after, and adapted across contexts. Hi Ben, pleasure to have you here. You have spent over 2 years on your PhD project at Tsinghua now. So from observing China from the outside to studying and working here, what new insights have you gained about Chinese modernization?
I think what's very unique about China's development model is it has always been focused on raising the living standards of everyone. So when Deng Xiaoping initiated the Reform and Opening Up in 1978, the idea was, yes, we're going to allow, private market forces and private companies and foreign investment, but the idea is to raise the living standards of everyone, not just a small handful of elites. And there's a quote that is often attributed to Deng that is a bit misleading, which is to get rich is glorious. But if you actually look at what Deng said, his argument was that some provinces, some areas of China would get rich first, but then they would have a responsibility to help the less developed areas catch up. So the idea was that everyone should develop, everyone should become prosperous, not just a small handful of elites. And we see that today this has become the top priority in China through Gongtong Fuyu, the Common Prosperity Campaign. And China has made huge progress in this.
As an academic here, you have a very deep understanding of China. I'm also curious, how do the larger international academic community appreciate China's approach to modernization?
In the past few years, I think, especially as it's become easier for Europeans to come to China, now that Europeans can come without applying for a visa, I think there are people who are finally learning more about China and how Chinese society works. And in particular, if you look in academic circles, there's more and more discussion of industrial policy. And what's fascinating is, if you go back to the 1980s, it was more Chinese economists who were trying to learn from the West. And now I think it's actually Western economists and policymakers who are trying to learn from China's experience. In particular, in the way that the Chinese government was able to combine government planning and state investment in public infrastructure and education and other public goods with private market forces, because obviously China has a socialist system, but it's a socialist market economy, and it has very strong competitive forces and lots of companies that are competing with each other to make better goods and provide better services. And that combination of having state-led investment and planning with private competition, I think, is what a lot of countries are now trying to emulate. And that's something that's very unique about China, because if you look at the US, the government's emphasis is always on the private sector and not on the government actually providing the public goods and investment necessary for a better, more competitive environment. In Europe, we do see a kind of similar philosophy. There's more state investment, but not to the same level as China. So it's fascinating how in the past few decades, China has gone from trying to catch up with the West to now some Western countries are trying to catch up with China.
Now I would like to narrow our focus to the Global South. A key question is, how applicable are China's lessons when other developing countries attempt to replicate the success stories you just mentioned?
I spent a long time living in Latin America, and the experience is similar in many parts of Africa, where these are countries that are still developing. Many people are in poverty. They still lack a lot of the basic public infrastructure needed in order to industrialize and develop. And they look at China's example as a model for how they can also try to develop their own countries. And in particular, if you look at Latin America and Africa, these are continents that have heavily deindustrialized in the past few decades, and they become much more dependent on exporting raw materials and agricultural products, on exporting these commodities. So they're also trying to learn from China's experimentation with industrial policy in order to also move up the value chain to industrialize and to provide better paying jobs and all of the positive externalities it has for the rest of their economy.
Can you be more specific? Perhaps draw some examples for us.
We now see that China has what they call the three new things, the Xin San Yang. And these are electric vehicles, EVs, solar panels, and also batteries. And this is very important for the renewable energy transition, the transition away from fossil fuels, and in order to reduce climate change, a move toward green energy. And China is actually making that possible for the world by providing very inexpensive solar panels and EVs, which is a game changer for so many global South countries. Because first of all, a lot of global South countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Latin America, they have chronic blackouts. Their electrical grids are not sufficiently developed. So Chinese solar panels will really help a lot of these countries to strengthen their electrical supply, and not only strengthen the electrical grid, but actually decentralize the electrical grid. Because sometimes in places like sub-Saharan Africa or Pakistan, which is also a very big, very populous country, you have people living in rural areas who are not connected to the electrical grid. So solar panels have now become the cheapest form of energy thanks to China's massive investment. So we see, for instance, Pakistan has been investing very rapidly and very heavily in solar panels. Electric vehicles are also a huge win for the global South, because a lot of people in the global South, especially who are not in major cities, don't have access to good transportation. And EVs are in many cases cheaper than ICEs, the traditional gasoline cars, and they're often easier to repair, by the way. But another major factor here is that a lot of global South countries chronically have shortages of hard currency, primarily dollars, which they need in order to pay for oil imports. So a lot of countries in the global South are forced to ration oil, and people have to pay very high prices for gasoline because the country doesn't have enough foreign currency to pay for those oil imports. So if these countries can instead leapfrog over ICE cars and instead use EVs and low-cost Chinese EVs, this will also help countries to reduce their need for oil imports, which is obviously good for the environment. It's good to stop climate change, but it's also economically good for them. So this is another example of win-win cooperation. And I'll mention one other here, which is that we see more and more Chinese investment in Latin American countries and African countries and some Southeast Asian countries so these countries are not only importing Chinese technologies, but they're also manufacturing some of this Chinese technology locally, which is very important because these countries also want to industrialize. And they're actually kind of following something similar to what China did after the start of the Reform and Opening Up, launched by Deng Xiaoping in 1978, where China welcomed in foreign investment and created joint ventures.
I noticed that in your videos and articles, you repeatedly argue that under a neoliberal economic system traditionally led by the global North, countries in the global South are often locked into unfavorable positions in global value chain, even to the degree of deindustrialization. So in your view, how is working with China different? Could such cooperations help these countries achieve structural breakthroughs?
There are some concerns in the global South about deindustrialization, but we should keep in mind that deindustrialization in Latin America and Africa, this is a problem that actually really goes back to the 1980s and 90s. This is a problem that started well before China became a major industrial power. And a lot of this has to do with the neoliberal turn in the 80s and 90s in the global South, where a lot of these governments, they abandoned industrial policy, they privatized state-owned enterprises, they privatized the infrastructure that they had, and they allowed foreign companies, primarily Western companies, to buy up a lot of those assets. So a lot of these global South countries lost their industrial capacities in the neoliberal period. And now what we see in the past decade is much more interest in developmentalism, in state-led development following China's model, and in industrial policy. So I don't think it's fair for when Western economists blame China for deindustrialization of the global South, because many of these global South countries were already deindustrialized before China itself became a manufacturing superpower. And now I think what these countries in the global South can do in order to continue to move up the global value chain and industrialize is they should borrow from China's own development experience. And we're already seeing some examples of this. So I mentioned that, after Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up in 1978, Deng had this idea of technology transfer for market access, right? This was a very important idea where China did want foreign investment because Chinese companies did not know how to manufacture a lot of these very important products, like cars, for instance, or TVs and computers. So they did invite foreign investment in, but it was not simply that foreign companies could use Chinese labor because Chinese workers at that time were paid lower wages. But it was also so that Chinese companies and researchers could benefit from technology transfer. And I think we now see more examples of this. I mentioned the example of Brazil, where now like BYD is opening factories in Brazil and making partnerships with local companies in Brazil. I think this is a great example that kind of echoes what China did in the 1980s and 90s. And I think many other countries in the global South can do the exact same thing.
Thank you very much for your insights. I would like to go further. The countries in the global South are a very diverse cohort, and especially the smaller nations might not be able to replicate what China has done. What is your suggestion?
It's very difficult for very small countries to industrialize and become major manufacturers because there is something people refer to as economies of scale. When you have a very large country like China that has 1.4 billion people, you have so much capacity that you can have specialization in different provinces and you can have many different companies compete. You have all these advantages from scale. Whereas if you're a small country with 10 million people, it's very difficult to do the same thing. So instead you have to specialize. And I think, Singapore is an interesting model. A lot of small countries in the global South have looked to Singapore and tried to borrow some of their policies. That said, it's kind of difficult to replicate everything that Singapore did because Singapore also was in the right place at the right time. It benefited from being a connection between the West and China, especially after China started the reform and opening up. Singapore also benefited from its very strategic geopolitical position, where it is in the Straits of Malacca. But the point is that Singapore recognized that there were these certain vacuums that existed in the world and they could specialize and fill those vacuums. So I think as we see more trade between China and other global South countries, and as we see the US engage in more protectionism and try to carry out so-called decoupling, I'm still skeptical about this idea of decoupling, but we see that it's a priority for the US. So inevitably, I think there's going to be more trade among the BRICS countries, the global South countries. So I think the smaller countries that don't have hundreds of millions of people like Brazil, like Mexico, they're going to have to find ways to specialize and they can be part of this larger regional supply chain. So I think actually at Beida, there's a brilliant Chinese economist, Justin Lin Yifu, who has talked a lot about the importance of countries finding their comparative advantage within these global networks, these global supply chains, and using that and specializing in these certain areas because we know that today in the globalized economy, these supply chains are very complex. And you mentioned that China does dominate a lot of the supply chain, but the supply chain is so complex and so big, not all of it can be located in China. We see small parts for cars and different electronics and things like that all over the world. There are thousands of different parts and in different, not only in China, not only in different cities and provinces in China, but in countries all around the world. And we've seen that some countries have specialized. As an example that comes to mind, Turkey, a major power, a regional power, but that connects East and West. Turkey has played an important role in supply chains, for instance, for buttons. Turkey has become a world leader in creating buttons. These kinds of things, I think a lot of global South countries will replicate. And when you look at Latin America, for instance, I think it makes perfect sense for the countries of Latin America to also deepen their trade and their economic integration among each other. And this is something that they've been trying to do for a long time through organizations like the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and also Mercosur, which is a trade bloc in South America. And I think, especially with more Chinese investment and joint ventures and technology transfer, I think a lot of countries in Latin America can also develop together. And while also trading with China, they can also start trading with other countries in Latin America, and you can have this local specialization. You can have, countries in Central America that are much smaller work with bigger countries, Argentina, Chile, Brazil. I think there are a lot of possibilities there, and they should basically kind of replicate what China did with its provinces, right? But you are right, with your question that there are a few things that are unique about China, primarily its size and its thousands of years of history, that also gave it some advantages that are very hard to replicate.